Welcome to the Art Colony, a podcast about art and art history in Provincetown. My name is Gaston Lacombe. Friday evenings in the summer are very special in Provincetown. That's when we have the fabled gallery stroll. Art galleries all over town stay open later in the evening because on Fridays we have exhibit openings, visiting artists, wine and cheese, and plenty of good company. So if you're planning a trip to Provincetown this summer, make sure to stay over for Friday evening too. You won't regret experiencing the Provincetown Gallery Stroll. And we have so many art galleries to choose from, somewhere around 50 of them, give or take a few. So you're bound to find something you will enjoy. And if you're looking specifically for art created by local artists, then I should recommend to you that you go to Gallery 411. They have a great selection of local artists. And we'll talk about that today with the owner, director of the gallery, who's also a wonderful artist, my friend Liz Carney.
Hi.
Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. It's so good to be here.
Well, I'm very glad to have you here.
Thank you. I want to just really thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I love your podcast.
Well, I'm glad you do. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
So tell our listeners, who is Liz Carney?
I'm an artist, a painter, and I'm an entrepreneur, an art educator, a property manager, and I think in as well as you mentioned, I'm an art gallery owner, and I think that's sort of an umbrella over all of those things. You know, to be an art gallery owner, I'm bringing together my paintings, other people's paintings, the aspect of being an educator, a property manager, all of the details that go into keeping the place humming, and and an entrepreneur, obviously, and I could say more. But we'll start there. We'll
have a whole hour to say more. I remember I did an episode with Anastasia Aguiley a long time ago. Well, a long time ago, it's about a year ago.
Okay.
And we talked about the family dynasties in Provincetown. And one of the families I named as, if you hear the name, I named a bunch of names. I said Carney, they're a Provincetown artist. So tell us about your family. Tell us about the Carney family presence here in Provincetown.
Thank you for asking about sort of the big picture of my family, which is not that far back. And when you think about, Provincetown families, legacy families, but, my mom and dad were both Irish immigrant families, and they grew up, and my mom grew up in Roxbury and my dad grew up in Dorchester. So I hear a lot about kind of the New York and Provincetown connection, but they were Boston kids. They were 12-year Catholic school graduates, and my mom was never going to go to college. They both were the first in their family to go off to college. And my mom got a scholarship to MassArt. She was going to go wrap gifts at Filene's with her mother. One of the nuns said, you're too talented, you're too smart, and, we can help you. So from very humble background, my mom had gone to MassArt. She studied art education to be, practical, but she had been exposed, I'm sure, because she was there between the years of like 1948 to 1952 to, sort of the excitement of modernism and what was happening in the art world. And I'm sure she heard about Provincetown. My dad, who had met her, I think, in a summer party somewhere in Scituate, introduced himself and was reciting poetry to her. So they met over a poem. He was also right out of college, and they fell in love, and they had 9 kids. I think when my mom was turning 50, it was, I'm the youngest of 9 kids. There's 8 girls and 1 boy. He's the oldest. And my dad and mom had kind of grown up with this history of renting rooms, like my dad was, my grandmother who came over from County Roscommon always used to say, a house divided brings more rent. So we always rented rooms. And that was, his upbringing. And my mom went to Provincetown. She had a cousin here and that she would visit, and all the kids in the station wagon. And I think she saw 411 and was like, oh, well, this is a no-brainer. It's already cut up into little apartments, like a little guest house. And not that little a guest house. So she bought the house in around 1980. And I think, she had a chance to paint. It was really her turning a page in her life and saying, I've done my, duty of raising 9 kids although I was still quite little. I was probably about 7 or 8. We, and my dad was thrilled. He was like, my wife really is a talented painter and deserves this. So we rented out all the rooms. We lived in 6 girls in 1 bedroom, and my mom had the other bedroom of a 2-bedroom apartment. And then the rest of this big house, this rambling house at 411 Commercial Street, was filled with painters and writers and, drag queens. And it was really good. So, yeah, there's a lot of people in the family, who are artists. My mom, of course, was an artist. I have nieces and nephews, next generation now, to see them come up and be doing their creative passion. So
Let's stop a little bit and talk about 411 Commercial Street.
Oh, right.
Because as you said, it's a big house. It's very noticeable. It's right there on Commercial Street. There's almost no porch. You're right there on the street. And it's now your art gallery. But the house has quite a history as well. Can you tell us a bit the history of the house?
Well, you mentioned that there's no real porch, but there had been a porch. So when the house was built in the, I think the early 1900s, it looked very much like the house directly across the street, which has a lovely front porch and this kind of Victorian, the leaded glass windows and there's a particular name for this kind of window, but all of that architectural richness was stripped off. So somewhere in the 1960s, and when it was popular to have aluminum siding on your house. So people always say, "Oh, you should restore that house to, if you take that aluminum siding off, I'm sure there's some beautiful architectural detail." I'm like, no, it was completely stripped. And then they removed the porches and kind of reclaimed the footprint of that and built right up to the street and put in some very 60s looking Anderson casement windows, which are so not Victorian. And so the house is a bit of a beast, actually. It's a big house that has lost some of its architectural detail, but what it's lost in architectural detail, it's made up for in a lot of love and connection in the inhabitants of the house, I shall say. So there's a lot of richness in the people.
If you look at the very detailed website by David Dunlap, Building Provincetown, you can find a little bit the history of 411 Commercial Street there. And it says that it was, for most of its life, it was a guest house or an apartment house. And until 1960, it was called the Francis Guest House. And after that, it was bought by a Provincetown artist. Can you tell us about this artist?
Yes, sure. Well, to back up originally, I did hear that the house was built for a woman named Mrs. Sparks. So initially, I'm very curious who Mrs. Sparks was, and I haven't found out much. Some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, in the dead of winter, a little old lady was standing in front of the house with her granddaughter. And she's looking up at the house and holding a picture, and then looking at the picture and looking at the house and saying, "Well, I know we're at 411 Commercial Street, but this doesn't look at all like the house." And it turns out that her great-grandfather or her grandfather or somebody had built the house. And so we're thrilled to have now we have a photo of the man who built the house, and it's incredibly well built. So he was a builder from Plymouth, and I think it was, Mrs. Sparks, whether she was widowed or perhaps never married. I think she had been married, though. She commissioned this beautiful home on sort of a sea captain style home on the East End water side of Commercial Street. And then I think how it got turned from a single family home into the Francis Guest House, I'm not totally sure. But as I mentioned earlier, rooming houses to rooming houses in 3 generations. So there's an old expression about how, when times are tough, renting out rooms is a way to make ends meet. So I don't know where and when in the history of the house it made into little efficiencies, but it's now an 8-unit property. So there's a basement apartment, and then, first floor has 2 units, and then the second floor has 4 little studios, and then the top floor. And so my mother bought the house her cousin owned it briefly, and then my mother, I think, took over the mortgage, which was being paid directly to Nassau Staffness. And I know this because I found Nassau's little sort of receipts from the monthly payment. So that was back in the day when if you didn't have a bank, you just go pay directly to the people who were selling you the house. So that was a pretty cool little piece of history to see Naso Stefanos, who was a very well-respected, hard-edged abstract painter who was, well known of the generation of painters who came out of Provincetown during that, 50s and 60s.
And it's an artist that I have a specific interest in learning more about because you said he does hard edge painting, which is what I do.
Absolutely.
And I keep on having people coming to my gallery and saying, oh, this is not like the art of Provincetown, or I've never seen art like this in Provincetown. And I keep on thinking, you're not wrong. You're not right, because I keep on finding out more information about people like Naso Stefanos, who were doing art here that was not necessarily the traditional Provincetown post-impressionist style.
Sure,
so I'm always interested in learning more about Naso Stefanos.
Totally. Your work really does resonate. Yeah.
Another thing I read about him as I was doing research for this is that Naso Stefanos was also a world-famous tree peony breeder. And he had over 500 different breeds of tree peonies. So I was wondering, do you have any interesting peonies in your yard?
We don't have peonies in our yard, and the connection to horticulture for sure. My mother has, made a beautiful garden at 411, and since my mom has passed away, we're so happy that it got to be on the garden tour. It was a dream of hers to be on the garden tour, and after she passed away, our upstairs tenants made it their mission to just really keep the. If it was up to her 8 daughters, none of us have a green thumb, so my sister Joni might say otherwise, but we're not really great at the gardening. But I didn't know about Nasos, but maybe that could, a peony or two could get into the the garden.
Tree peonies, which is a slightly different variety. You can look in your garden.
Yes.
Maybe you'll find them. But I read an article also where you said that after your mother bought the house, your house was filled with artists and poets and writers and all sorts of people coming through. Can you tell us a few stories about that?
Absolutely. Well, I would imagine even before my mother bought the house, because it had already been, like I said, divided up into these little efficiency units. Many of in the apartments to this day have the same little rickety showers. We have not gone in rehabbing. So we have the same Formica counters in my mom's apartment that we had the year we moved in. You know those little all-in-one kitchen units? Sometimes you see the sink. There's like a sink and a little stovetop and a mini fridge. For years, the apartments had that. So the people who lived in our house, there's so many. And I think about, as a kid, John Dowd moving into our house the year, like probably shortly after he came to town, and he was just getting started painting. And we had a wonderful artist. He lived right upstairs, and he had his player piano in his tiny studio apartment. It was like such a wonderful bon vivant to have living upstairs from you, and you can hear everything. It's like the sound of the player piano, and parties with people going up and down the stairs. We had Richard de Quattro, who was a fantastic painter, who's still in town. He lived where the gallery is now. And I think I credit him to blessing the gallery with so much good energy, because he always had great incense burning and disco music. So I feel like all that good vibes are sort of soaked into the floors. Ryan Landry and his partner Scott lived on the top floor for many years.
Scott Marino?
Yes, Scott Martino. And he and Ryan just were wonderful tenants, because they just always kept it lively and fun. And Scott would help my mom in the garden, and Ryan would encourage my niece Grace to sing, and and then just come down for dinner. Any of these people who lived with us, Liz McLean, who was an art handler for many years, and built a business driving from Boston, New York to Provincetown over and over again, delivering artwork for people. So we also had writers like Candace Reef. Her partner, she and her partner owned a store that was really popular in the 80s called Rising Sun, a clothing store. And, poets from the work center who maybe stayed on an extra year. So you really had, wonderful. Paul Lasicki. I just think of Paul. I loved we had Paul, he's a wonderful poet who lived upstairs for many years. And I could go on, but one of my favorite stories, though, is at the gallery. I was looking at the guest book, and a woman had written in the guest book, I lived in this apartment when the gallery was a rental unit, an apartment, and your mother, I couldn't find a place to live, and your mother rented to me, and no one would rent to me because I had twin 2-year-olds. And she said, "Oh, I've had twins. I know what it's like. I'll rent to you." I think, I remember the letter carrier walking by and saying, "Oh yeah, I lived there." Like everybody's sort the guy who ran the blackjack table at Foxwoods lived there for many years, Philip Barboza. I think we just had a lot of really a cast of characters. It wasn't just about artists and writers too, but just about the people who make Provincetown kind of cool and interesting.
That's important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Desiree who lives there now, who's a waitress at Chotch and is well known, and she's always the door girl at Showgirls, or Paul Rizzo who lives upstairs. So we're lucky. We're
Yeah.
very, very blessed.
So at what point did the house become a gallery? Well, at least the part that is a gallery, because it's not the whole house that's a gallery.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So the gallery is actually rather small. It's about 350 square feet, and it's the storefront, sort of ground floor front of the house, which is quite close to the street because, as I mentioned, they tore the porch off and kind of enclosed it and expanded the footprint of the house. And they must have done that, like I said, in the 60s. But so that part of the house, the little front, is the gallery. And it was, I founded the gallery in 2011. And it was after many years, I would say to my mom, we should put a gallery here. I think it would be really great to have a gallery here. And she'd say, over my dead body, because Richard lives there. And that was Richard DeQuattro. And she said, well, she would never ask someone to move out because somebody in the family wanted to, she was a good landlady. And she said, no, Richard's there. Richard had lived there for 20 years, I think, at that point. And so Richard got an affordable housing unit, I think, through one of the lotteries with Ted Malone and and he got a place I think off on Nelson Ave, one of those great townhouses. And thank God for that project, and thank God for affordable housing in Provincetown. And I said, maybe before we rent this to anybody, could we try to see what we could, see if we could make it into a gallery. So that's when that happened, 2000. Right. So I think Richard moved out maybe a couple of years before, and then we were there were people who lived in it short term, like we did a summer here or winter rental, and then it was like, I'm ready to open a gallery. And that was a big decision. But
welcome back. Here's my reminder again. Every week I tell you, follow us on Instagram at The Art Colony Podcast. You'll find out who the next guest is, and we post all sorts of interesting clips. And also, if you want to help us out and support the podcast, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com. You can go there and do a search for The Art Colony Podcast, and you can leave us a little tip and help support us and keep us on the air. And thank you very much. So Liz, let's keep on talking about the gallery. So 2011,
yep,
you opened the 411 Gallery.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a specific idea, a specific philosophy of who you wanted in the gallery and what type of art you wanted to show?
It was a bit unclear for me, actually. I had been showing in Provincetown at that point for maybe almost 20 years. I probably had my first show in Provincetown in the mid-90s. Having grown up here every summer, I knew, I was an intern when I was in college at the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. I was, the people who lived upstairs from us, they were all artists, or, so I felt like I was really very lovingly supported by this town. And so by the time my very first show, though, I will say my very first time showing in a gallery was kind of traumatic because the gallery, a lot of great people showed at this gallery. It was a sweet little gallery, and the curator had an amazing eye. I won't mention names, but so many people showed at this gallery. Michael Landis, Michael Carroll, a wonderful painter named Jen DiTaccio, who I just admired. She was probably just a couple of years older than me. Jonathan Blum, all these painters. Chet Jones showed there. But the guy who I think I sold like out my first show, and I was so proud. I worked all summer and I was thrilled that a gallery was giving me a show. And he had some trouble paying his artists. So like I had that experience, which is like not one you'd want to have as your very first experience, but it happens.
Yeah, it
And
happens. It still happens.
It does still happen. And
I have an artist
yeah.
who shows in my gallery in the summer,
Uh-huh.
and this winter he showed in the gallery in San Francisco, and he's now in court about it because
Right.
he didn't get paid, and some of his work was almost kept hostage for a while. So yeah, respect the artists.
Respect that. So that was my formative first experience at a gallery, and I was so mortified too. And it's funny how like my experience was like I just sort of internalized somehow, whereas other people did actually go to small claims court and stuff. I just was like, oh no, this is so bad. But then I got a great gallery experience for many years at Schoolhouse when Michael Carroll, who also showed at this little gallery, had gone over to Schoolhouse to help David Davis, who had, after Long Point left the building, which was so sad. That was such a great gallery in Provincetown. And then, but Schoolhouse created something new. And so I was very, very fortunate to show there for maybe another 10 or so years. I think maybe more, maybe 12, 13 years. And so it was scary to open a gallery. I really also knew that by becoming someone who's self-represented, it was like a big shift. Like, although it's something done in Provincetown, I feel like Provincetown has so many artists like yourself who are representing themselves. And I think the internet and so much social media has transformed the landscape of how artists are relating to their work in a commercial way. I was still really nervous about changing that hierarchy and stepping out of line a bit and being a woman-owned gallery. So I started it as 411 Studio, which seemed a bit safer. I wasn't saying I'm a gallery. I'm saying I'm a studio. And I had and I would paint in the space. So I would paint there and have other artists. Kind of this space has two sides. So you could kind of be on one side painting. And but that was really hard to be painting while people walked in. I think about
welcome to my daily life.
Yes.
Yeah.
So eventually I think over time, the gallery just, in a way, trusting the process, it began to show me what it was meant to be. And I worked in art education for 25 years, so I love people. I mean, you got to love. I love the enthusiasm of teaching people and showing people new things. And so when people come into the gallery, and I loved the ability to talk about who this person's work, or and then also the artists themselves, to talk to them about what do they need, how do they want to be shown. So I feel like that relationship of education and affected my programming. So I became not so much a very salesy gallery, but I felt that 25 years of teaching art and I was still doing both. Actually, I had the gallery, while also running a kids art program in Dorchester, going back and forth. It was kind of wild. But those hats of being a gallerist and an art educator really blurred for me, and more and more local artists who needed representation kept showing up and becoming part of our roster.
I did not know you started as I did, as a studio / gallery.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a very specific way to run your career and also to run your gallery. Mm-hmm. I just thought you had started right away with the whole slew of artists and started representing.
No, I think there's a handful of artists who are still with the gallery. I'd say of all the artists who were in the first year, Helen Grimm, who I remember I was still putting fresh paint on the walls, and she knocked on the door very sweetly. And if you know Helen, she's just embodies sort of courtesy and kindness. And so she, most people probably wouldn't be able to get away with knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, will you look at my paintings?" But there was just such a humility and warmth. And so she said, "Hi, I heard you might be looking for some artists. My friend, Mary Giamarino, a painter who I really love." So I heard Mary's name and I said, "Oh, okay. I'd love to see them." And she had a few paintings tucked under her arm, just little 8x10, and they were exquisite. And she, you know, it was probably like early May. I had no idea really what we were going to do. I was planning like one show at a time, it seemed. And she's here 16 years later.
Yeah,
And
she's one of those artists. When I walk around Provincetown and look in the windows of the houses, I almost always see a Helen Grimm.
I know.
She's very popular. Her paintings are very unique and beautiful.
Yeah, she really is someone who, I think also she's someone who's really, she's a community person. She's, raised her family in Truro. She grew up in the Outer Cape. She worked in the Truro schools and what an interesting story Helen has is also that she has a whole other career as a nurse, because as a young artist and trying to figure out how to make ends meet and have a young family, it was like, oh, what can I do to support myself? And because art is, not always an easy way, as you know. So
it's unpredictable.
Her role in the community is, she's involved in like community, the public health department and community gardening and the schools, and her art seems to segue effortlessly and makes her not just a beloved artist, but a beloved member of the community. So.
And you mentioned also Mary Giamarino.
Yes.
So she's been there since the beginning as well?
No? Mary actually came later, but Janine Evers, who is a wonderful painter, abstract painter, who, how I found artists at the gallery, I knew I wanted to work with local people. I was at a dinner party probably a few months before I was opening the gallery, and I saw a very small 6-inch by 6-inch painting on someone's mantelpiece, and I said, who is that? You know how you see it and you know. And Janine Evers, I said, your paintings are extraordinary. She went to Bard. She then went to SVA. She's and moved to Provincetown probably a few years before I opened the gallery. And I just, here we are 16 years later, and her works are not as well known, I think, to people in Provincetown in the community. Whereas you said Helen's works have been collected by lots of people recognize her work immediately. But you would recognize a Janine Evers painting. She has a very distinct voice and is a strong abstract painter, and I just love her. Mm-hmm. So those two women then picked, along the way, like Mary Giamarino, who had been showing at Julie Heller for many years, reached out one day and said, "Hi, Liz, I'm thinking I might like to get a new gallery." And I was like, yes, I'd love to show you. So there are painters, we are very, very fortunate.
And of local artists, you now also have Paul Rizzo, who lives in the house, and he's also represented by your gallery. You have Naya Bricker.
Naya Bricker, yeah.
Bricker, yeah, I said it wrong.
Oh, Bricker. And we have a nice connection, which is that the year I opened the gallery, sitting there 70 hours a week, I realized I'm going to need to get help. So I went to Smith College, and I went back to my alma mater, and I said, I know you have internships. And one of my painting professors said, he was still there at Smith, here we were 20 years later. And he said, there's a young woman that you should meet. Her name's Naya Bricker. I said, her name's Naya. And then Naya took the internship that summer at Fine Arts Work Center and is now working there. But she came to Provincetown to, kind of be just exploring during her junior year what's possible. And here she is, 15 years later. She volunteered at the gallery one day a week. And I showed her painting while she was still an undergrad, because she's such a good painter.
She's amazing, yeah.
She did this big 8-foot by 8-foot still life of a heap of plastic refuse, like recycling. And it was the most wonderful shard of plexiglass or glass that had her reflection in it. So a self-portrait. And I just, remember her, I think her dad driving it down in a minivan and us it arrived in, she always says it arrived in Provincetown before me. I feel like these are the stories that really make me happy when I think about the adventures of the gallery. And it's not just women artists. We've, obviously you mentioned Paul Rizzo, but there is a kind of a quality to an homage to my mother and her having one son and 8 daughters. like, to cultivate a creative life and to what she had gone to art school. And though she never said any of us should become artists necessarily, we were always exposed to drawing, music, these important qualities that give us our humanity.
So if somebody right now would show up with paintings under their arm, what would be some advice you would give them, considering the sort of the image your gallery has cultivated over the last 16 years? What would be, how would they be able to convince you to take them into their gallery?
Well, I think that the best way to get to know or to be kind of really positioning yourself to have a conversation with a gallerist or a curator is to, be going to openings, be at the openings, go to them, find out what's happening at that gallery, maybe attend, if there's a certain painter or a few that you really love, attend their shows, make a point to come up and say what you like about the show that's up now, create an opening for a dialogue about, not just about your work, obviously, which is important. You do want to talk about your work as an artist and you want to, but I think it's a two-way street to really be supporting the, even if you can't buy a painting, that's absolutely, I sometimes say we're like the least commercial gallery on Commercial Street because we've traded less. I had a woman who wanted to buy a painting. We traded lesson plans for the nonprofit I was working for in exchange for like a big discount. Like, we're not trying to, we don't want to be an intimidating kind of gallery at all. So, to approach with why you like this gallery. And then it might open a dialogue for, and tell me a little bit about your work. So I think that that can happen in Provincetown like no other place too. I mean, I'm sure it happens everywhere, but there's something about it in Provincetown where you just leave a conversation at an opening, and then the next day you run into them in the frozen food section at the Stop and Shop, and you're like, oh hey, there's a kind of density of experiences in the art community that you'd be walking along Hatches Harbor and going for a swim, and you'll see people that you just saw yesterday at the some art opening.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. The density of the art community here. You really have, it's not an exception to be an artist. It's not something you see 1 in 100. We're really right on top of one another here. There's a big density.
Yeah. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question a bit. There's so much an artist can be doing by having all of the sort of checklist of professional things. I have to, do I have a resume? Do I have an artist statement? Do I have, good quality images of my work? Maybe a website, and certainly maybe a social media presence if you do social media. But I think it's also about getting to know the programming at the place that you'd like to show, and really getting to know the programming, maybe really studying the other painters so that you can situate yourself into that. Because I think a gallery is not just about, a bunch of siloed artists, but really what's the whole feeling of the gallery.
So Liz, we've been talking about all these other artists now, but we can't forget to talk about you as an artist. Yeah. Tell us, what is it that you do?
Okay, so I'm a painter, and I feel like there's as I've mentioned that I spent many years teaching art, and obviously now I'm managing a gallery and managing the house that we grew up in, and we're trying to be a steward of the house that in the best way that I can to kind of keep it in the spirit of how my mother had it, or maybe how Nasso's Daphnis had it, or Mrs. Sparks. But so I have a busy life. I feel like making sure that I paint is really um, is an important task. And I started I feel like I kind of rest on my laurels a bit, and I started painting young. I started at around 14. My mother introduced me to a wonderful institution in Boston called the Fenway Studios. And there was a man who taught portraiture, and I would go with her every Saturday morning. And growing up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood where, as they would say, in Dorchester, they'd say, "Liz, you're wicked good at art. You're good at drawing." It wasn't like it felt a little conspicuous to be an artist. And another thing, the boys growing up, they tease you and kind of bully you a bit. If I'm walking to the train station and in my middle school years wearing all black, they'd say, "You where you going? Harvard Square? You look all Harvard Square." I was like, "Well, Harvard Square is not it's a predicate nominative. You can't use that in that." But anyway, I was sort of I just always wanted to be kind of searching and different. And so, and I started, I think my mother noticed around 14 that I had definitely sort of an identity of an interest in art. And I had this opportunity to go to Robert Cormier's portraiture classes every Saturday with her. And there were no young people in these classes. This was all, people well into their adult years. And it was such a gift. It was unlike, and these are the oldest art. I think in Boston, this building was specifically designed as artist studios in the late 1800s, and with the north light and creaky wood floors, and so I think that earliest experience of portraiture trained my eye, and I was young enough that I think that hand-eye coordination, the kind of intense looking at a time that as a girl too, to be a young girl, 14, where, really just the male gaze is like, almost dangerous, at that age. You're just, and I probably could have easily found myself with my eyes down on the floor, that confidence, not feeling. And but this gentle man, this teacher, Robert Cormier, would say, look more closely, like you had to lift your eyes and lift your gaze. And so that experience of rendering, being able to render, a portrait is a really challenging, you immediately know that there's something wrong with the mouth. You immediately know, so that I had some pretty rigorous training, and I did not go to art school. I went to Smith, as I mentioned. So that was a chance for me to be kind of a big fish in a small pond. So when you go to art school, you're with all these incredibly talented, it can really be probably, my mother actually discouraged it because she had gone to art school, and, and I had good grades. I was kind of a bit of a nerd. So I had gotten into a good college, liberal arts college, and studied painting. I regret that I haven't gotten an MFA. I've always wanted to get an MFA. So maybe someday it's never too late.
No, it never is.
And
although I'm not going back to school.
I know. I feel like I just want to clone me. I want to do everything. So in the years that I went, from college to, I've been mostly a representational painter, but I'm influenced very much by some of the people I studied with in Provincetown. I had I think about Paul Resica was one of my teachers in Provincetown where I don't think he'd remember me, but I sure do remember him coming into the classroom and saying, it was I forget where it was, at Pam or at Falk or something, but he said, Mickey Mouse. And I was like, what is this guy talking about? And it was really about understanding how to make space with three circles. And that just blew my mind, this idea of, the picture plane and Hans Hofmann and the pictorial space. And so, I'm a painter who's, I love to work plein-air. I still work from observation. My tendency is to paint with a sort of heightened color. I did also do some study with the Cape School. And once that gets into your palate, it's almost impossible to rid yourself of the. But I think that what Provincetown has gotten into me and into my work, a love and respect for abstraction and the formal concepts of, line and composition and a deep respect for the people who've come before us. And then how to still make a painting that feels like it's today, how to still paint what's, and get the feeling of what is of importance right now. I'm not sure how I can do that, but I keep trying.
And you work a lot in plein air, because if somebody would come and say, how would you describe a Liz Carney? I would say, well, just walk around town. You'll find her with an easel somewhere, painting
Yeah.
with a lot of energy. That's how I imagine you.
Oh, yeah.
In plein air, working on an easel and with a lot of color and a lot of energy. Am I right?
Absolutely love. I'm totally indebted to the plein air. My first plein air easel was in college, and it was not a kind of Cape School impressionist. It was a teacher in college who took me out plein air painting in the hills of Western Mass. I just loved that it was very embodied. There's something physically embodying about standing up at an easel in the weather, in the wind, in the sun with the bugs and the stuff that feels so alive. Like, I have had moments where, like, standing out at the end of the pier, painting fishing boats or painting the view of the town, looking back over the water at the town, and just feeling like this is all there is. Like, this is it. And then frequently I have that feeling again. Like, as long as I don't know why plein air painting it just really does that for me. I was speaking the other day to an artist who's like, oh, I never want to paint in my French easel. I'm like, I also love dancing when I'm painting. I love when I'm standing on my feet at a French easel in whether it's the sort of excitement of what's happening on the street around me, or if it's just the sound of some crickets in the dunes, whatever it is. I just feel like I'm in a zone and I'm in a place, and it sounds kind of cliche, but it's
that's
true.
how it is. That's how it is with a lot of artists. We get in a zone.
Yeah.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier about your family and about the different generations. So do you have another generation after you now in the Carney family that's following in the footsteps of grandma or of Aunt Liz?
Absolutely. I'm so proud of the way, my nieces and nephews, for example, my nephew John and his sister Grace and their little brother Robert spent a lot of years busking on the street in Provincetown, and they would stop traffic. They were so good. And Grace would sing at showgirls, and Grace is now going off. I think I just had a conversation with my brother. She's going off to get her second MFA at Dartmouth. Just like, I'm really proud of, and John is back living. I'm so excited. He's back living on the Cape, on the Outer Cape. He just moved to Truro. He's getting married in the fall to another wonderful family life, kind of like one of those families of, she grew up here in Truro, and my niece Mirren, she's not currently working in the arts in a way that you think traditionally, but she's doing some really interesting geographic information system and mapping for, think about someone like Mark Adams and cartography and how.
Oh yeah, Mark Adams' art really depends a lot on cartography.
Yeah, and sort of like expanding the notions of art. I have another niece who's a data scientist. And while I don't think of these professions necessarily as art, obviously, I just know that spending time with them and their watching them in their grandmother's garden, or spending time with that the influence of the arts gets into all of them. So I'd say yes and yes, next generation, and maybe even the generation after that, the next one who's baby Wavy, who's only 3 going on 4. And when she was at the Carnival Parade a couple of years ago, she was crawling right up the middle of Commercial Street. And I was thinking, oh, that's what it's all about. To see, my mother wasn't alive to see her great-grandchild born, but to see her great-grandchild watching the Carnival Parade from the same place my mother would watch the Carnival Parade, and where we would have lemonade stands for all the kids. So there really is something that I feel is like it's a privilege and a gift. And that's also too probably why we want to share it with so many people in Provincetown. Like, we still have the same 2-bedroom apartment that's my mom's. We've, and we still have all these tenants. We want to keep it that way.
Okay, we're now at the speed round section of the interview.
Yeah.
So this is the first question. I'm very happy with my first question because it's based on something you mentioned and also something I read in an article about you. So painting in plein air, would you rather paint from the shore looking at the pier or from the pier looking at the shore?
Absolutely on the pier.
Yeah.
Looking at the shore. I love it. And you know what's funny? It took me decades to understand that was really about my mom, because my mom would paint the pier from the dining room table at 411, and she'd be looking out at the pier, so focused, so intently, making her watercolors. She did these really, tight horizon lines with all the activity of the pier, and then these very loose skies. But it took incredible focus. And finally, I realized that when I would stand on the pier, I was always looking back as if I was looking at her. And so I'm always going to be looking at Mom.
You're always going to be on the pier.
Yeah, always on the pier.
Second question. You have to choose oil paints or watercolors?
Oil paint.
Oil paints?
Yeah.
Oh, because a lot of the work I've seen from you lately has been watercolors.
It's about, I do love watercolor, and it's also that it's about ease and the ability, like, I've been sharing a lot of travel watercolors, and it's really hard to paint in oil and travel.
That's true, yeah.
So, but I am a sucker for some, rich impastoed oil paint. Okay. I do love it.
Okay, next question. Since we talked about the fact that you were a teacher, do you prefer teaching or learning?
I learn through teaching. I mean, it's when I'm teaching and I feel like in the act of talking about something or explaining it, I feel like I've internalized it more deeply. So there you go. That's
and
a double.
It's funny, you're not the first teacher to say that on our show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to talk about Provincetown politics. We have different clubs here in Provincetown. You have to choose foxes or rabbits.
Oh, foxes. Kids, the little. I in fact, maybe today I might go out to Race Point to see if they're dancing around the little, where they make their home under the old Coast Guard station. So
for some listeners that might not know, in Provincetown we have this population of fox that live in town. They're almost domesticated. They're not really afraid of people much. Sometimes you're walking down the street and you have a bunch of fox kids just playing in the middle of the street. But then there's also a lot of rabbits all over, and the fox feed on the rabbits. So you have, the ones who like the fox, the ones who prefer the rabbits.
I just love watching them. I love watching the baby fox.
They're so cute.
Yeah.
Okay, last question, and this is always the most important question. Pies or brownies?
Brownies.
Oh, really?
I stopped at Farland on my way here and got a brownie.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah. You know what? And boy, I got I've gone through phases where I didn't have sugar, and I might be heading back toward one of those phases because I've been liking brownies a little too much. Yeah. Well, great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it reveals a lot about a person. Yeah, I'm having the same sugar issues right now. Oh, if I eat just a little bit of sugar, I go in complete comatose coma. Yeah. I can't function anymore. So I have to stay off the sugar. But for me, I mean, I remember telling my ex-husband a long time ago, when we were organizing his parents' funerals, I was saying, when I die, I want the buffet to be all pies. Oh, savory pies and sweet pies, just pies. So you must love the Commons Pie Contest when they do that. Well, they always do that when I'm working. Oh, I know. We need to get you an assistant. Maybe we could get you one of those Smith interns. Oh yeah. Well, if you have an in for me, let me know. Okay. Well, Liz, this has been a complete pleasure. I'm so happy we had a chance to sit down and talk.
I love your show. I love you. And I'm honored to be able to share, I've really listened to some like amazing, particularly like the one with Ginny Binder and her reframing significance, and to hear, of course, the heads of all of our nonprofits in town. And you've been doing such important work to preserve some part of Provincetown history and really elevate a conversation. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm putting my history degrees to work.
Oh, I didn't realize. See, I didn't know. I want to ask, who's going to interview you?
Actually, that's coming up.
Oh, good.
Because that's been a constant demand since we started the show. So yeah, okay. Stay tuned. There's going to be an episode where things might be flipped around. Well, thank you for being here, Liz. Have a great day. And thank you to all our listeners and viewers. Have a great day as well.